Blood pooling on the linoleum floor of a roach-infested Bronx apartment wasn't how I pictured my end. As my vision faded, the crackling television in the corner broadcasted the society event of the decade. The royal wedding-style nuptials of my sister Audrey to my former fiancé, Liam Prescott. My family, the Harrington dynasty, beamed in the background, toasting to the golden couple. I had spent 25 years begging for their scraps, twisting myself into knots for a fraction of their love, only to be framed, discarded, and left to die in the cold. I closed my eyes, praying for the quiet of oblivion, but the universe had a sicker sense of humor. I didn't fade into the dark. I woke up. 5 years earlier, the exact day they threw me away, and this time, I'm taking everything. The first thing I registered was the scent of French lavender and expensive linen. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating smell of mildew that had just filled my dying lungs. I gasped, my back arching off the mattress as my eyes flew open. My hands clawed at my chest, expecting to find the gaping, jagged wound from where the intruder's knife had plunged into my ribs just moments, or was it years, ago. There was no blood. There was no pain. There was only the soft, muted morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling silk drapes of a room I hadn't seen in half a decade. I scrambled out of the California king bed, my bare feet sinking into the plush, hand-tufted Persian rug. My breathing was ragged, shallow. I stumbled toward the massive, antique gilded mirror resting against the far wall of the bedroom. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the gaunt, hollow-eyed 25-year-old ghost who had just bled out on a cheap linoleum floor. It was me, but younger. My cheeks were full. My skin carried the expensive, radiant glow of someone who had never known true hunger, and my eyes, though wide with shock, lacked the dead, haunted emptiness that Liam and my family had eventually carved into them. My trembling fingers reached for the rose-gold iPhone resting on the mahogany nightstand. The screen lit up, flashing the date in crisp, unforgiving numbers. October 14th, 2021. My 21st birthday. The day my life had officially ended the first time around. A hysterical, breathless laugh bubbled up from the depths of my throat, quickly turning into a sob that I fiercely swallowed down. I collapsed onto the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands as the memories of the future crashed over me like a brutal, unforgiving tidal wave. I remembered it all. In my past life, today was the day the Harrington family, one of the oldest and most ruthless real estate dynasties in Manhattan, would formally sever ties with me. For years, I had been the scapegoat. I was the erratic, difficult, lesser daughter, compared to Audrey, the pristine, angelic golden child. But the final nail in my coffin had been the Harrington Foundation Gala. Audrey had meticulously, flawlessly embezzled over $4 million from the charity, funneling it through offshore accounts. When the auditors from Deloitte caught the scent, she hadn't just covered her tracks. She had laid a breadcrumb trail directly to my laptop, my bank accounts, and my signature. And Liam. Sweet, aristocratic Liam Prescott, heir to the Prescott shipping empire, and my fiancé of 2 years. I had run to him, crying, begging him to help me prove my innocence. Instead, he had looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, handing over evidence to my parents that cemented my guilt. He had been sleeping with Audrey for a year. They had planned the entire thing to remove me from the line of succession and secure the merger of the Harrington and Prescott fortunes without my interference. In my previous life, When my parents summoned me to the drawing room on this very morning, I had broken. I had fallen to my knees. I had screamed, begged, and pleaded. I had wrapped my arms around my mother's legs, sobbing until I choked, swearing my innocence. My father had coldly kicked me away, handing me a severance contract and throwing me out of the Fifth Avenue penthouse with nothing but the clothes on my back and a paltry $50,000 hush money check. I spent the next 4 years spiraling into poverty, legally barred from the industry, blacklisted by every contact, and entirely broken in spirit. The knife in my ribs in that Bronx apartment had just been a physical manifestation of what they had already done to my soul. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. I walked into the massive walk-in closet. The first time, I had tried to pack my designer gowns, the Cartier watches, the Hermès Birkin bags my parents had gifted me, only for my mother's security guards to rip them from my hands, stating they were company property. This time, I didn't touch them. I reached into the back of the closet and pulled out a simple, scuffed leather duffel bag I had bought myself during a brief, rebellious backpacking trip to Europe. Inside, I packed only the essentials: my passport, my birth certificate, my social security card, a few plain t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, and a warm coat. From my jewelry box, I bypassed the diamonds and the Harrington heirloom pearls. I took only a simple silver locket my grandmother had left me, the only person in this bloodline who had ever actually loved me. I slipped it around my neck. I walked over to the vanity, picked up a tube of crimson lipstick, and carefully applied it. My hand didn't shake. I looked at the girl in the mirror. She was dead. The Chloe Harrington who craved her mother's warmth and her father's approval had died bleeding on a dirty floor. The woman staring back was something else entirely. The heavy oak door to my bedroom opened without a knock. Maria, the head housekeeper, stood there, her eyes darting away in discomfort. "Miss Chloe, your parents are waiting for you in the drawing room. Mr. Prescott is there as well." "Tell them I'll be right down, Maria," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of the morning-after anxiety I had felt the first time around. I grabbed my duffel bag, slinging it over my shoulder. The game hadn't changed, but the player certainly had. The grand drawing room of the Harrington penthouse was a masterclass in intimidating opulence. Vaulted ceilings, dark mahogany paneling, and a massive marble fireplace that crackled with an unseasonable fire. As I descended the sweeping staircase, the scent of my mother's signature Chanel No. 5 drifted upward, mingling with the bitter aroma of freshly brewed espresso. I paused at the threshold, taking in the tableau before me. It was exactly as I remembered. My father, Richard Harrington, sat behind his imposing antique desk, his face a mask of granite. Beside him stood my mother, Beatrice, draped in a pristine white cashmere sweater, her posture impeccably rigid. Sitting on the velvet tufted sofa was Audrey. She wore a pale pink dress, her blonde hair falling in soft, perfect waves, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. And standing behind her, a protective hand resting on her shoulder, was Liam. The sight of Liam's hand on my sister's shoulder sent a phantom ache through my chest, but I ruthlessly crushed it. "Chloe!" My father's voice boomed, chilling the air in the room. "Sit down." I didn't sit. I walked slowly into the center of the room, my worn leather duffel bag hanging heavily by my side, and stood tall. "I'd rather stand, Richard. What is this about?" My use of his first name caused a visible ripple in the room. My mother's eyes widened, a flash of pure indignation crossing her elegant features. "How dare you speak to your father that way, especially after what you've done?" Beatrice snapped, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed outrage. "What have I done, Beatrice?" I asked, tilting my head. Audrey let out a performative sob, burying her face in her hands. "Don't play dumb, Chloe. The auditors from Deloitte called yesterday. The $4 million from the Children's Hospital Fund, they found the transfers. They traced them to your offshore accounts in the Caymans. How could you? Stealing from sick children?" Liam stepped forward, his handsome face twisted in an expression of deep disappointment, the same expression that had shattered my heart into a million pieces in my past life. "We didn't want to believe it, Chloe, but I had my firm's analysts look into the IP addresses. The authorizations came from your personal laptop. It's over. You need to take responsibility." I looked at Liam. Really looked at him. 5 years ago, I thought he was a god among men. Now, I just saw a weak, opportunistic parasite who was terrified of crossing my father and desperate to secure Audrey's larger share of the inheritance. "Responsibility," I repeated, tasting the word. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't drop to my knees and beg them to check the security cameras, to look at Audrey's secret second phone, to see the truth. They didn't care about the truth. They just needed a scapegoat to protect the golden child. My father slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the mahogany desk. "The lawyers at Skadden Arps drafted this overnight," he said, his tone devoid of any paternal warmth. "It is a formal severance agreement. You will sign over your 10% equity in Harrington Enterprises back to the holding company. You will relinquish any claim to the trust fund your grandfather established. You will sign a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding this family and the company." "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice entirely flat. "Then I hand the Deloitte report over to the district attorney," Richard stated coldly. "You will face federal wire fraud charges. You'll spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Choose, Chloe, your freedom or your place in this family." Audrey peeked through her fingers, waiting for my breakdown. She was waiting for the screaming match, the desperate wails of innocence, the satisfying spectacle of my total humiliation. Instead, I walked over to the desk. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen resting beside the folder. I didn't even open the document to read the terms. I flipped straight to the back page, where the bright yellow sticky notes indicated the signature lines. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I signed my name flawlessly, legally binding my disinheritance. The silence in the room was deafening. It was so quiet, you could hear the traffic on 5th Avenue 20 stories below. My father stared at the signed document, his jaw slightly slack. He had prepared for a war. He had brought Liam for emotional leverage. He had armed himself with legal threats. My immediate compliance short-circuited his entire strategy. You're not going to deny it?" Liam stammered, stepping away from Audrey, genuinely unnerved. "Would it matter if I did?" I replied, capping the pen and dropping it onto the desk with a sharp click. I looked directly into my father's eyes. "Where is the check?" "Excuse me?" Beatrice gasped. "The severance check. Section 4, Clause B of your standard disinheritance framework. I'm assuming you're offering me the standard buyout to ensure the NDA holds up in court. What is it, 50,000? I held out my hand, palm up. Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He opened a drawer, pulled out a cashier's check from Chase Bank, and threw it onto the desk. "You sicken me. Taking this money after what you stole." I picked up the check. $50,000. In the grand scheme of the Harrington wealth, it was less than pennies. But to me, right now, it was the seed of my empire. I didn't steal a dime, and you all know it, I said, my voice low, dropping the polite facade. I turned my gaze to Audrey, who suddenly looked very small on the large sofa. Make sure you enjoy Liam, Audrey. He prefers his women agreeable and his bank account's full. Let's see how long he stays when you realize you're incapable of running this company without a scapegoat to hide your colossal incompetence. Audrey's face drained of color. Dad, make her leave. I'm going, I said, adjusting the strap of my duffel bag. I looked at the 3 people who shared my blood and the man I almost married. But understand this, I am not leaving because you are kicking me out. I am leaving because the Harrington name is a sinking ship of mediocrity and fraud. And when it finally goes down, don't you dare reach out to me for a life raft. I didn't wait for their response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the drawing room, my spine straight, my head held high. I walked out of the penthouse, stepped into the private elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, a single tear escaped my eye, a final tribute to the girl who had died. I wiped it away aggressively. That was the last tear I would ever shed for the Harringtons. Stepping onto the brisk, autumn-swept pavement of Fifth Avenue, the reality of my situation hit me. I had $50,000 to my name, no credit cards, no trust fund, no elite degree, as my parents had strategically forced me to drop out of Columbia to help with the family charity, ensuring I had no independent credentials. In the eyes of the New York elite, I was radioactive. But I had something infinitely more valuable than a trust fund. I had 5 years of hindsight. I took the subway down to the financial district. The first order of business was severing any financial ties my family could track. I walked into a small, inconspicuous branch of TD Bank, bypassing the massive Morgan Stanley and Chase institutions my father had influence over. I deposited the cashier's check into a newly opened high-yield checking account and immediately applied for a secured credit card to begin rebuilding my destroyed credit score. Next, housing. I couldn't stay in Manhattan. The rent would drain my capital too fast, and I needed every cent to execute my plan. I took the train across the river to Greenpoint, Brooklyn. It took 3 hours of walking and negotiating, but by 4 p.m., I had signed a month-to-month lease on a tiny third-floor walk-up apartment. It was cramped, the heater clanked ominously, and the view was a brick wall, but it was mine. No one could hold it over my head. Sitting on the bare mattress that evening, I opened my cheap, refurbished laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. It was mid-October 2021. I closed my eyes, sifting through the encyclopedic knowledge of market trends, corporate crashes, and explosive mergers I had absorbed during my years of misery. In my previous life, I had spent my time in poverty obsessively tracking the financial world, torturing myself with the news of Harrington Enterprises' continued success. But in doing so, I had inadvertently memorized the exact timeline of the global market. I needed a massive, rapid return on investment. I couldn't wait years for standard stock growth. I needed leverage. Then, it hit me. Lumina Genomics. In exactly 2 weeks, on November 1st, 2021, Lumina Genomics, a struggling mid-cap biotech firm currently trading at a dismal $4 a share, was going to announce a successful Phase 3 trial for a revolutionary Alzheimer's drug. But that wasn't the kicker. The very next morning, Pfizer would announce a hostile takeover, buying out Lumina at $45 a share. In my past life, it was the biggest financial shockwave of the quarter. I transferred $45,000 into a newly opened brokerage account leaving myself just $5,000 to survive on. The moment the funds cleared the next morning, I didn't just buy Lumina stock. I bought short-term, out-of-the-money call options. It was a massive, incredibly risky play. If I was wrong about the date, the options would expire worthless, and I would be utterly destitute. But I wasn't wrong. The next 2 weeks were agonizing. I lived on ramen noodles and instant coffee, spending my days in public libraries researching the current state of Harrington Enterprises. I mapped out their supply chains, their debt structures, and their upcoming development projects. I found the cracks. Audrey's embezzlement hadn't just been a one-off, it was a symptom of a larger rot. My father was over-leveraged in commercial real estate, completely blind to the impending shift toward remote work that the post-2020 landscape was cementing. Then, November 1st arrived. I sat in my freezing apartment, staring at the ticker tape on my screen. At 9:30 a.m., the market opened. At 10:15 a.m., the press release hit the wires. Lumina Genomics announces unprecedented efficacy in Phase 3 trials. The stock price didn't just climb, it violently gapped up. By closing bell, it was trading at $22. I didn't sell. I knew what was coming. The next morning, at 8 a.m., the Pfizer acquisition was announced. Lumina halted trading, reopening at $44.50. My hands shook as I hovered my cursor over the Execute Trade button. I clicked Sell to Close on all my options contracts. The confirmation screen loaded. I stared at the account balance. My $45,000 hyper-leveraged gamble had just liquidated into $2.1 million. I leaned back against the cheap drywall, letting out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 5 years. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was armed. But $2 million wasn't enough to crush a billion-dollar dynasty like the Harringtons. I needed an institution. I needed an entity that could rival them, backed by people who operated in the shadows of high finance. I needed Sebastian Croft. Sebastian Croft was a myth in the private equity world. Ruthless, brilliant, and famously reclusive. In my past life, he was the man who eventually engineered the hostile takeover of Prescott Shipping, ruining Liam's family just a year before my death. He hated legacy families. He hated nepotism. He was a self-made apex predator. I knew exactly where he would be tonight. The Vanguard Charity Gala at the Pierre Hotel. It was an exclusive, invite-only event for the Titans of Wall Street. A ticket cost $20,000, assuming you could even get past the vetting committee. I didn't have a ticket, but I had a brand new bank account, a flawless memory of the venue's security layout, and a burning need to introduce myself to the devil. I took $2,000 from my new fortune and walked into a high-end boutique in Soho. I bought a sleek, backless emerald green Tom Ford gown that fit me like liquid armor. I had my hair styled into sharp, unforgiving waves. When I looked in the mirror this time, the girl who had cried in the Harrington penthouse was entirely gone. Standing there was the architect of their destruction. At 8 p.m., I stepped out of a black town car in front of the Pierre. The flashbulbs of paparazzi popped as billionaires and socialites walked the red carpet. I didn't walk the red carpet. I slipped through the side entrance designated for the catering staff, a blind spot I remembered because Audrey had once drunkenly stumbled out of it during a party. I bypassed the security checkpoint, shedding my coat in a service hallway, and confidently pushed through the swinging doors straight into the glittering, chandelier-lit ballroom. The room was a sea of tuxedos and diamonds. And there, standing alone by the grand windows overlooking Central Park, swirling a glass of neat scotch, was Sebastian Croft. He was younger than I expected, with sharp, predatory features and eyes as cold as a winter ocean. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and walked directly toward him. My war had officially begun. The Vanguard Charity Gala buzzed with the low, rhythmic hum of old money and new power. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided through the crowd with trays of Dom Perignon, while the titans of Wall Street exchanged whispers that would dictate the fates of global markets by Monday morning. I ignored all of it. My eyes remained locked on the solitary figure by the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sebastian Croft didn't look like a billionaire private equity shark. He wasn't wearing the standard-issue Brioni tuxedo or the aggressively large Rolex. His suit was bespoke, midnight blue and subtly understated, matching the quiet, dangerous stillness of his posture. As I approached, his gaze shifted from the glittering expanse of Central Park to me. His eyes, a striking, icy gray, swept over my emerald green gown, registering my face with the momentary, calculated recognition. "You're trespassing," he said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, devoid of any surprise. "Security usually catches the crashers before they reach the caviar. I'm assuming you didn't come through the front door, Miss Harrington." I didn't flinch. "You read the society pages, Mr. Croft? I wouldn't have pegged you for a fan of Upper East Side gossip." "I read everything that pertains to the boardrooms I intend to gut," he replied, taking a slow sip of his scotch. The disgraced, disinherited Harrington daughter. Thrown to the wolves just 3 weeks ago for embezzling charity funds. And yet, here you are, wearing $5,000 worth of Tom Ford, drinking my champagne. Are you here to beg for a job, or are you lost? I didn't steal a single dime, and I am exactly where I intend to be, I said, stepping into his personal space, forcing him to hold my gaze. "I'm not here for a job, Sebastian. I'm here to offer you a life raft. You're closing the Kestrel Mining acquisition tomorrow morning at 9. A $300 million buyout for the lithium deposits in Nevada." His eyes narrowed, the relaxed posture instantly vanishing. The temperature between us seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That deal is under a strict NDA. It hasn't been leaked to the press. Who gave you that information?" "It doesn't matter who gave it to me. What matters is what I know about it," I continued, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. In my past life, the Kestrel deal had been Sebastian's one public humiliation. "You think you're buying the future of electric vehicle battery supply? But on Thursday at noon, the EPA is going to release an emergency injunction. They're classifying the exact coordinates of the Kestrel site as a protected habitat for the desert agassiz. The moment that injunction hits the wires, your $300 million lithium mine becomes a worthless patch of protected dirt." Sebastian stared at me, his jaw tightening perfectly. He didn't scoff. He didn't laugh. He was too smart to dismiss highly specific intelligence, no matter the source. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out a sleek encrypted phone, and tapped out a rapid message. We stood in silence for exactly 2 minutes. The jazz band played a lively tune in the background. The socialites laughed. I waited. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and I watched a muscle feather in his cheek. He pocketed the device and looked back at me. The icy detachment was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory intrigue. "My contacts in Washington just confirmed a sealed EPA docket scheduled for release on Thursday. It involves Nevada land management. I just saved you $300 million, I stated, taking a sip of my own champagne. "Information is a commodity, Chloe," he murmured, using my first name for the first time. You didn't risk federal trespassing charges to do me a favor. What is the asking price for this little tip? I don't want a payout, I said. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a crisp, folded printout of my brokerage account balance. I slid it across the small cocktail table between us. Sebastian glanced at the paper. 2.1 million. Liquid. He looked back up, genuine curiosity bleeding into his expression. How did a disinherited scapegoat walk away with $2 million? I made a hyper-leveraged options play on Lumina Genomics 2 days ago. I turned my $50,000 severance check into seed capital. I lied smoothly, omitting the part about my future knowledge. I am not a victim, Sebastian. I am an architect. But $2 million isn't enough to do what I need to do. I need infrastructure. I need legal cover. I need the backing of a firm that strikes terror into the heart of legacy developers. And what exactly is it that you need to do? I am going to dismantle Harrington Enterprises piece by piece, I said, the venom in my voice finally slipping through the polished facade. And after I burn my father's empire to the ground, I am going to swallow Prescott Shipping whole. You've been trying to crack the Prescott family's grip on the East Coast logistics ports for 3 years. Partner with me. Give me a desk at your firm, an autonomous discretionary fund, and your legal team. In exchange, I will hand you the keys to both empires within 18 months. Sebastian was quiet. He looked at the brokerage statement, then at me. In the brutal world of high finance, trust didn't exist. But mutual ambition was a currency he understood perfectly. You're a ghost, Chloe Harrington, he said softly. Your family thinks you're rotting in a gutter. They won't see you coming. That, I smiled, a cold, sharp curve of my lips, is the entire point. He raised his glass of scotch, tapping it gently against my champagne flute. Welcome to Vanguard Holdings, Miss Harrington. Let's go hunting. 3 months later, January 2022. The corner office of Vanguard Holdings offered a panoramic, God's-eye view of Manhattan. It was a far cry from the cramped Brooklyn walk-up I had rented just 3 months prior. My desk was a massive slab of black marble, currently buried beneath stacks of architectural blueprints, mezzanine debt contracts, and supply chain manifests. Since bringing me into his firm, Sebastian had kept his word. He gave me a shell company to operate under, Axiom Capital, and completely masked my identity from the market. To the outside world, Axiom was just a newly formed, aggressive boutique firm bankrolled by Vanguard's deep pockets. To me, it was a scalpel, and I was about to make my first incision into the Harrington family's flesh. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, staring at the financial projections on my dual monitors. Without me, the internal mechanics of Harrington Enterprises were rapidly decaying. For years, I had been the invisible workhorse. I was the one who cross-referenced the zoning laws, audited the contractor bids, and quietly fixed Audrey's catastrophic mathematical errors before my father ever saw them. Audrey was brilliant at shaking hands, smiling for the cameras, and attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies. She was fundamentally incapable of actually managing a billion-dollar real estate portfolio. The cracks were already showing. My private investigator had forwarded me the minutes from the latest Harrington board meeting. My father, Richard, had reportedly lost his temper, hurling a crystal tumbler across the room when he realized their flagship project, the Hudson Yards Zenith Tower, was 6 weeks behind schedule and bleeding capital. Audrey had forgotten to secure the secondary tier of municipal permits, resulting in a complete halt of all electrical work on the site. Liam, who had officially joined the Harrington Executive Board after our broken engagement, was scrambling to cover for her. But his expertise was in shipping logistics, not Manhattan real estate law. They were floundering. You have that look on your face again? A voice broke through my concentration. I looked up to see Sebastian leaning against the doorframe of my office. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. Over the past 3 months, our dynamic had shifted from a wary alliance to a razor-sharp partnership. We were cut from the same ruthless cloth, though my ruthlessness had been forged in trauma, while his was innate. "What look?" I asked, swiveling my chair to face him. "The look that says someone is about to lose a lot of money." He smirked, stepping into the room and glancing at the blueprints on my desk. "The Zenith Tower. Ambitious, overpriced, and currently a massive liability for your father." "A liability I am about to weaponize," I said, tapping a manicured fingernail against a specific debt contract on my desk. Harrington Enterprises didn't self-fund the Zenith project. They took out a $200 million mezzanine loan from a syndicate of smaller banks to cover the construction costs. It's a strict contract. If construction is halted for more than 30 consecutive days, the loan goes into technical default and the creditors can call in the entire principal immediately. Sebastian's eyes gleamed as he caught on. "And thanks to your sister's inability to file basic municipal paperwork, they are on day 28 of a complete electrical halt." "Exactly," I smiled. "But the banks don't want to call in the loan." "If they force a default, they end up owning a half-finished skyscraper they don't know what to do with. They're terrified." "So you bought the debt," Sebastian concluded, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. "I didn't just buy it. I bought it at a steep discount," I corrected him. "Through Axiom Capital, I approached the lead syndicate bank yesterday. I offered to buy the $200 million note for $160 million in cash, assuming all the risk." They were practically weeping with gratitude to get it off their books. I stood up, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out toward the distant cranes of the Hudson Yards. "Tomorrow is day 31, I said softly. "Tomorrow, the covenant is breached. And tomorrow, Axiom Capital issues a formal demand for immediate repayment of $200 million to Harrington Enterprises. They don't have the liquidity, Sebastian. Richard has all his cash tied up in offshore accounts to hide it from the IRS. When they can't pay, you foreclose on the Zenith Tower," Sebastian finished, stepping up beside me. "You steal their crown jewel right out from under them." "I don't steal," I corrected, looking at him. "I repossess." The next morning, the financial district woke up to an earthquake. I sat in my office, watching the Bloomberg terminal as the news broke. Axiom Capital had formally declared Harrington Enterprises in default on their Zenith Tower loan. The market panicked. Harrington's stock plummeted 12% in the first hour of trading. At 10 a.m., my secure office phone rang. It was my lawyer, Reynolds, who acted as the public face of Axiom. "They're panicking, Chloe," Reynolds said, his voice laced with amusement. "Richard Harrington just called me personally. He was screaming, demanding to know who the partners of Axiom Capital are. He offered to restructure the debt at a 20% premium if we just give him a 90-day extension." "Deny the extension," I said coldly. "Tell him Axiom Capital doesn't negotiate with mismanaged firms. Initiate the foreclosure proceedings immediately." "Understood. And what about his request for a meeting with the firm's leadership?" I paused, a dark, satisfying thrill coursing through my veins. "Tell him the CEO of Axiom is currently unavailable. Let him sweat. Let him realize he's bleeding out and he can't even see the shark that bit him." I hung up the phone. Miles away in the Harrington penthouse, I knew exactly what was happening. Richard would be tearing his office apart. Beatrice would be clutching her pearls, terrified of the social embarrassment of a public default. And Audrey would be crying, realizing that her incompetence had finally caused a catastrophe that couldn't be swept under the rug. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one cleaning up their mess. I was the one who lit the match. February 2022. The fallout from the Zenith Tower default was spectacular, but a billion-dollar dynasty doesn't die overnight. Like a wounded animal, Richard Harrington lashed out, liquidating smaller, profitable assets just to keep the firm's daily operations afloat. The society pages called it a temporary cash flow issue. I called it exsanguination, but I knew my father wouldn't go down without exhausting every lifeline, and his biggest lifeline was currently sleeping with my sister. Liam Prescott fancied himself a white knight. With Harrington Enterprises bleeding, he convinced his father, Arthur Prescott, to leverage Prescott Shipping's assets to secure a massive, high-interest bridge loan. They were going to inject $300 million into Harrington Enterprises to stop the foreclosure of the Zenith Tower and stabilize the stock. It was a romantic, sweeping gesture that solidified Liam and Audrey as New York's golden couple. In my previous life, that merger of assets had created an untouchable monopoly. This time, it was exactly the fatal mistake I had been waiting for. They filed the preliminary paperwork for the bridge loan this morning, Sebastian said, tossing a thick dossier onto my marble desk. He poured himself a measure of bourbon, a rare indulgence for a Tuesday afternoon. Prescott Shipping is putting up their entire fleet of East Coast cargo vessels as collateral. If we let this loan clear, your father pays off Axiom Capital, reclaims the Zenith Tower, and lives to fight another day. I didn't open the dossier. I just smiled, leaning back in my chair. We aren't going to let the loan clear, Sebastian. We're going to let them step right to the edge of the cliff, and then we're going to cut the rope. Sebastian raised an eyebrow. I'm listening, Sans. Prescott Shipping is built on a house of cards, I explained, pulling up a map of the eastern seaboard on my monitor. To maximize profits over the last 5 years, Arthur Prescott has been illegally deferring essential maintenance on their older cargo vessels, specifically the massive freighters docking in Newark. In my research, I discovered that their flagship vessel, the Oceanic Vanguard, has a critical flaw in its ballast water management system. It's an environmental disaster waiting to happen. In the original timeline, that disaster had happened in late 2023. The Oceanic Vanguard had leaked thousands of gallons of toxic sludge into the Newark Bay. The EPA fines had been astronomical, but because Prescott and Harrington had already merged, they had the capital to pay the fines and bury the scandal. If that ship is flagged by the Coast Guard before the bridge loan clears, I continued, my voice cold and precise, Prescott Shipping's stock will crater. The underwriters for the bridge loan will panic and pull out, citing a material adverse change in Prescott's financial stability. Liam won't be able to save Audrey. He won't even be able to save himself. Sebastian's eyes darkened with predatory delight. How do you know about the ballast system, Chloe? That kind of internal engineering data is classified. Even my people couldn't dig that up. I used to share a bed with the heir to the company. I lied smoothly, staring blankly out the window. Men talk when they think you aren't smart enough to understand what they're saying. Sebastian chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. I will have my contacts at the Port Authority initiate a random and highly aggressive inspection of the Oceanic Vanguard by tomorrow morning. Are we shorting Prescott Shipping? We are heavily shorting Prescott Shipping, I confirmed. Execute the trades through Axiom's offshore accounts. When the Coast Guard report hits the press, I want us holding the knife. 72 hours later, the trap snapped shut. I sat in the Vanguard Holdings conference room, sipping green tea as I watched the CNBC broadcast on the massive flat screen. The banner at the bottom of the screen was flashing in aggressive red. Prescott Shipping halted amidst EPA investigation. Fleet grounded in Newark. The Coast Guard hadn't just found the ballast leak. My anonymous tip had pointed them directly to the falsified maintenance logs, signed by Arthur Prescott himself. It was no longer just a negligence case. It was federal fraud. The market reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Prescott Shipping's stock opened 40% down, and just as I predicted, the syndicate of banks underwriting the bridge loan for Harrington Enterprises immediately pulled their funding. The fallout was chaotic. I hacked into the Harrington internal servers, using an old backdoor I had built years ago to fix Audrey's IT mistakes, and tapped into the executive boardroom's security cameras. I watched in high definition as the golden couple finally cracked. Liam was pacing the length of the Harrington boardroom, his face pale, his hair disheveled. Audrey was sitting at the table sobbing, while my father looked like he was on the verge of a stroke. "You promised us that capital, Liam," Richard roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. "Axiom Capital is moving to seize the Zenith Tower in 5 days. If we lose that building, our creditors will trigger cross-default clauses on all our other properties. We will be ruined." "My family is facing federal indictments, Richard," Liam shouted back, the aristocratic polish completely stripped away. "My father's assets are frozen. I can't give you $300 million when my own company's stock is trading at the price of a cheap sandwich." Audrey stood up, her tear-streaked face twisting into something ugly. "You useless coward! You told me you had this under control! You told me Prescott Shipping was invincible!" Liam stopped pacing and looked at Audrey. The disgust in his eyes was palpable. It was the exact same look he had given me the day he framed me. "Don't you dare call me useless, Audrey. I covered up your $4 million embezzlement. I lied to the auditors. I threw Chloe to the wolves for you. And all you've done since taking her place is run this company into the ground. You're a parasite." Watching them tear each other apart, I felt a deep, profound sense of closure. I reached over to the keyboard and terminated the feed. I didn't need to watch the rest. The rot was doing exactly what rot does. It was consuming them from the inside out. The Harrington and Prescott alliance was dead. Now, it was time to collect the corpse. April 2022. The foreclosure auction for the Hudson Yards Zenith Tower was held in the austere, mahogany-paneled conference room of Skadden Arps, the very same law firm where my father had forced me to sign away my birthright 6 months ago. The poetry of the universe was not lost on me. Because it was a private auction initiated by the debt holder, Axiom Capital, it wasn't open to the public. The only people in the room were the auctioneer, a few predatory real estate developers hoping to pick up a billion-dollar property for pennies, and the Harringtons. I arrived 10 minutes late, purposefully. I was flanked by my lead attorney, Reynolds, and a Vanguard security detail. I wore a tailored ivory Alexander McQueen suit, my hair pulled back into a sharp, uncompromising chignon. The heavy silver locket my grandmother gave me rested against my collarbone. As the heavy oak doors swung open, the low murmur of the room ceased. My father was sitting at the front table, his posture rigid, the stress of the last few months etching deep, haggard lines into his face. Beside him sat Beatrice, looking pale and gaunt, her usual arrogant luster faded. And next to her was Audrey, nervously chewing her cuticle, looking like a frightened child. Liam was nowhere to be seen. He was likely busy dealing with his father's impending federal trial. Richard turned around to see who had interrupted the proceedings. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, His brain simply refused to process the information his eyes were feeding him. He looked at the ivory suit, the expensive legal team flanking me, and the aura of absolute terrifying control I radiated. "Chloe?" Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking, breaking the silence. Audrey gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What are you doing here? Dad, why is she here? Call security!" I didn't look at my sister. I walked calmly down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I stopped directly across the aisle from my father. "Mr. Harrington?" I said, my voice crisp, devoid of any familial warmth. "You look tired." Richard stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "Chloe, what is the meaning of this? You signed an NDA. You are legally barred from Harrington business. Get out before I have you arrested." I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp expression. I gestured for Reynolds to hand me a thick, leather-bound folio. I tossed it onto the table in front of my father. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "I'm not here as a Harrington," I stated smoothly. "I'm here as the CEO and sole proprietor of Axiom Capital. I hold the $200 million defaulted note on the Zenith Tower. I'm the one foreclosing on you, Richard. The color rapidly drained from my father's face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. He staggered back slightly, bracing himself against his chair. That's impossible. Axiom is backed by Vanguard Holdings. You're a disinherited dropout. You don't have the capital. You don't have the connections. I had $50,000 and a burning desire to watch you bleed," I replied, leaning in slightly, lowering my voice so only my family could hear. "You threw away the only person in this family who actually knew how to run your empire. You chose a thief and a fraud because she looked better in the society pages. So, I took your severance check and I built a guillotine." Beatrice let out a strangled sob. "Chloe, please. You're our daughter. You can't do this to your own flesh and blood. The company, it's our legacy." I turned my gaze to my mother, the woman who had stood silently by while I was discarded like garbage. "You severed that bloodline the day you let Audrey frame me, Beatrice. I have no family." Audrey suddenly stood up, hysterical, tears streaming down her face. "You set us up! You sabotaged the permits! You tipped off the Coast Guard about Liam's ships! You planned all of this!" "No, Audrey," I said, my voice rising just enough to command the entire room. "I didn't sabotage anything. I just stopped cleaning up your messes. You destroyed this family entirely on your own. I just bought the front row ticket to watch it happen." The auctioneer, looking incredibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could please proceed. The opening bid for the deed to the Hudson Yards Zenith Tower is set at $200 million to cover the outstanding debt." The room was dead silent. The other developers, sensing the radioactive family drama and knowing Axiom Capital had Vanguard's endless billions backing them, kept their hands firmly down. "Are there any bids?" the auctioneer asked. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the little girl who craved his approval to step back and save him. I held his gaze, my face an emotionless mask, and slowly raised my hand. "Axiom Capital bids $200 million, I said clearly. "Going once," the auctioneer called. "Going twice. Sold. To Axiom Capital." The gavel struck the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. It was over. The crown jewel of the Harrington dynasty now belonged to the daughter they threw away. I turned away from the devastated ruins of my former family, adjusting the cuffs of my suit. Reynolds, I instructed my lawyer, have the locks on the Zenith site changed within the hour, and draft an eviction notice for Harrington Enterprises corporate headquarters. We just bought their primary lender, and I intend to call in their mortgage by Friday. I walked out of the room without looking back. The ghost of Chloe Harrington was officially dead, and the heiress of Axiom Capital had just begun to reign. May 2022. The speed at which a billionaire's life can unravel is truly a spectacular thing to witness. Within 3 weeks of the Zenith Tower auction, Harrington Enterprises filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The cross-default clauses in their commercial mortgages had triggered an avalanche. Without the Zenith project to anchor their portfolio, the syndicate banks stripped my father of his remaining assets, like piranhas swarming a wounded calf. The Fifth Avenue penthouse was listed for sale. The Hampton estate was seized. But I knew Richard Harrington. He was a creature of immense pride and deep-seated paranoia. He wouldn't go down with the ship. He would try to steal the lifeboats. In my past life, long after I had been disowned, rumors had circulated on Wall Street that my father had successfully hidden tens of millions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts before the SEC could freeze his assets. It was money he used to live comfortably in exile while his creditors were left with nothing. Not this time. I sat in my office at Vanguard Holdings, a second cup of espresso warming my hands. Across the desk sat Reynolds, my lead attorney, and a former forensic accountant for the IRS. "He's moving the money," Reynolds confirmed, sliding a heavily encrypted dossier across the marble. "Just as you suspected, Chloe. Richard is attempting to wire $35 million from a dummy corporation in Delaware to the Cayman Islands. He's doing it in staggered sub-$1 million increments to avoid triggering the SWIFT network's automated fraud alerts." I smiled, tracing the rim of my espresso cup. The irony was almost too rich. The Cayman Islands. The exact location Audrey had used to frame me for embezzlement. "He's desperate," I murmured. "He knows the bankruptcy courts are going to pierce the corporate veil and go after his personal wealth by the end of the month. If those transfers clear the international clearinghouses, the money is gone. Untouchable," Reynolds warned. "Do you want me to file an emergency injunction with the bankruptcy judge?" "No," I replied, a cold thrill of absolute power washing over me. "An injunction just stops the transfer. I don't want to stop him, Reynolds. I want to destroy him. Package all of this data, the routing numbers, the IP addresses, the dummy corporation filings. Send it directly to the Enforcement Division of the SEC and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Flag it as an active attempt to defraud federal bankruptcy proceedings." Reynolds blinked, adjusting his glasses. "Chloe, that's a felony carrying a mandatory federal prison sentence. They won't just fine him, they will arrest him." "I am acutely aware of the sentencing guidelines, Reynolds. Make the call." 2 days later, the trap was sprung. But before the FBI could knock on my father's door, I had one final loose end to tie up. My private secure line buzzed. My assistant's voice came through the intercom, sounding slightly unnerved. "Ms. Harrington? I'm so sorry to interrupt. Security at the lobby level is asking for instructions. There is a young woman here trying to bypass the turnstiles. She's quite hysterical. She says she's your sister." I paused, looking at the sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline. "Send her up. Escort her directly to my office." 10 minutes later, the heavy glass doors to my suite swung open. 2 Vanguard security guards flanked Audrey as she stumbled into the room. The sight of her almost made me laugh. The pristine, untouchable golden child of the Harrington dynasty looked like a ghost. She was wearing last season's Prada, a clear sign she was cut off from the family credit cards. Her blonde hair was frayed, and her makeup was smudged from crying. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence had been entirely hollowed out. She stared at the cavernous, hyper-modern office, her eyes finally landing on me sitting behind the massive desk. "Chloe," she choked out, her voice trembling. She took a step forward, but the security guards instantly tensed. I waved them off, and they stepped back out into the hall, closing the glass doors behind them. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Audrey?" I asked, my voice polite, flat, and completely devoid of sisterly affection. She broke down. She actually fell to her knees on the expensive Persian rug. It was the exact position I had been in 5 years ago, begging for my life. "Please," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Chloe, please, you have to stop. Mom is having a nervous breakdown. Dad hasn't slept in days. Liam won't even answer my calls. His father is facing a federal indictment because of those ships, and Liam is blaming me for everything. I have nothing. I'm entirely broke." I stood up slowly, walking around the desk. I looked down at the top of her head, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, just a hollow, sterile emptiness. "You're broke because you are entirely incompetent, Audrey," I said softly, my voice echoing in the quiet office. "You thought running an empire was just attending galas and wearing the right diamonds. You thought you could frame me for your theft, and the universe would just let you get away with it." She looked up at me, mascara running down her cheeks. "I was scared. Dad was going to find out I lost the hospital money on bad investments. I didn't mean for them to disown you. I just needed a distraction." "And Liam?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Was sleeping with my fiancé for a year also a distraction?" Audrey flinched, her eyes dropping to the floor. She had no defense. She had nothing. "Get up," I commanded. "Get up off my floor. You don't get to come here and play the victim. You are the architect of your own destruction. I just handed you the hammer." She scrambled to her feet, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. "What do you want, Chloe? You took the Zenith Tower. You bankrupted the company. You won. What more could you possibly take from us?" Right on cue, the television mounted on the far wall of my office flashed with a CNN breaking news banner. I gestured toward the screen. Just that. Ugh. Audrey turned around. On the screen was live helicopter footage of the Fifth Avenue penthouse. 3 black SUVs with government plates were parked out front. The camera zoomed in just in time to catch my father, Richard Harrington, being led out of the building in handcuffs, flanked by FBI agents. Audrey let out a blood-curdling scream, her hands flying to her mouth. "No! Dad! What did you do?" He tried to wire $35 million to the Caymans to hide it from the bankruptcy courts. I stated coldly. I simply made sure the FBI was informed of his itinerary. I walked back to my desk and pressed the intercom button. "Security, please escort my guest out of the building. She is permanently banned from all Vanguard and Axiom properties." Audrey didn't fight them when they came back in. She was catatonic, her eyes glued to the television screen as her father was shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. The Harrington dynasty hadn't just been broken, it had been utterly annihilated. As the doors closed behind her, I picked up my pen and went back to work. September 2022, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newly completed skyscraper in Hudson Yards was the most exclusive event of the autumn season. The press had spent the entire summer rabidly covering the fall of the Harrington and Prescott empires. Arthur Prescott had taken a plea deal, agreeing to 3 years in federal prison for environmental fraud, to save Liam from being indicted as a co-conspirator. Liam was currently selling off his luxury cars to pay his legal fees, a pariah in the society he used to rule. Richard Harrington wasn't as lucky, facing multiple counts of wire fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and tax evasion. He was denied bail. Beatrice was living in a rented condo in Queens, surviving on the charity of former friends who were rapidly screening her calls. Audrey had quietly fled to Europe, hoping to escape the relentless paparazzi. They were gone, and I remained. I stood on the podium, the crisp September wind whipping the hem of my crimson Carolina Herrera coat. Behind me stood the towering, glittering glass monolith that was supposed to be my father's legacy. Instead, etched into the massive marble slab above the entrance, was its new name, the Vanguard Axiom Tower. Below me, a sea of reporters, politicians, and Wall Street elites waited with bated breath. Sebastian Croft stood beside me. Over the last 11 months, our partnership had evolved into something incredibly potent. He provided the shadows, and I wielded the knife. We owned the city. Nervous, Sebastian murmured, leaning in close so only I could hear. His sharp gray eyes glinted with a mixture of pride and something deeper, something intensely protective. Never, I replied, flashing him a devastating smile. I stepped up to the microphone. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding cascade of light. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly over the speakers, commanding absolute silence. "A year ago, the real estate and logistics markets of this city were dominated by outdated, corrupt dynasties. They believed that legacy alone was enough to sustain an empire. They were wrong." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd. I saw the faces of men who used to kiss my father's ring. Now, they were looking at me with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "Today, Axiom Capital officially absorbs the remaining liquidated assets of Harrington Enterprises," I announced, the words tasting like sweet, aged wine. "Furthermore, through a joint venture with Vanguard Holdings, we have finalized the hostile takeover of Prescott Shipping, restructuring their fleet to meet the highest environmental standards in the world." The reporters furiously typed on their tablets. It was the greatest consolidation of wealth and power Manhattan had seen in a decade, and it was spearheaded by a 22-year-old woman they had all written off as a disgraced socialite. "We are not here to maintain the status quo," I finished, raising my chin, looking straight into the lenses of the cameras. "We are here to redefine it. Thank you." The applause was deafening. It wasn't the polite golf clap of society galas. It was the frantic, desperate applause of people who recognized a new apex predator and wanted to stay off her menu. After the press conference, Sebastian and I took the private elevator to the penthouse suite of the tower. It was a massive, empty expanse of glass and steel, offering a terrifying, beautiful view of the empire I had just conquered. "You did it," Sebastian said, unbuttoning his suit jacket and pouring us both a glass of 20-year-old Macallan. He handed me the crystal tumbler. "The Harrington name is a cautionary tale, and Prescott Shipping is a subsidiary on our balance sheet. The board of Vanguard is terrified of you, by the way." "Good," I smiled, taking a sip of the smoky liquid. "Fear is a much more reliable currency than loyalty." Sebastian stepped closer, his presence commanding and magnetic. He reached out, his fingers lightly brushing the silver locket at my collarbone. "You told me you were an architect, Chloe, but you're more than that. You're a force of nature." "I was forged in the dark, Sebastian," I whispered, looking up into his eyes. "I just decided it was time to bring the fire." He smiled, a genuine, rare expression that softened the sharp edges of his face. He clinked his glass against mine. "To the fire." I turned back to the window, looking out over the sprawling, glittering expanse of New York City. The girl who had bled out on a dirty linoleum floor in the Bronx was a distant, fading nightmare. The family that had discarded me was rotting in prison cells and cheap apartments. The fiancé who had betrayed me was broken and destitute. I didn't just survive my rebirth. I didn't beg for my place back at their table. I bought the table, burned the house down, and built a skyscraper on the ashes. I am Chloe Harrington, and this is my empire, and that is how you execute the ultimate corporate execution. From a bleeding, discarded scapegoat to the undisputed queen of Manhattan real estate and high finance. Chloe didn't just get mad, she got everything, leveraging her second chance to utterly dismantle the toxic family that threw her away and the fiancé who betrayed her. If you love this story of vengeance, betrayal, and absolute power, you know what to do. Smash that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a ruthless comeback story, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, jaw-dropping drama. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments below. If you woke up 5 years in the past with all the knowledge of the future, would you use it to quietly build your own wealth? Or would you go straight for the jugular of the people who wronged you? Let me know!